And can you see my screen, Diane? Everybody?
No.
No? Let's try it again. It says I'm sharing. Hold on, let's try it again. How about now?
No. Do you want me to
Can
pull
you-
it up?
Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Remember that commercial?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, wait, hold on. Now, can you see it?
Yes.
See, I am technically savvy, I'll tell you what. All right. So let me first by apologizing for the change in days and times. It's all my fault. Even though Diana begged to take responsibility for that today, it's all my fault. And it's one of those things where you have an unexpected event in your life that kind of changes your time span. And mine happened to be the fact that my cable went out, my internet went out, and they had to rewire the whole kit and caboodle. It took them 4 days. So I apologize for that. We'll be back on track after this one. So I'm sure we're missing some people that had wanted to join. My name is Chris Bolin. I'm a UiPath developer. I've been developing UiPath for UiPath for about, 6.5, 7 years now. This is all I do. I'm a 2-time MVP. I do this kind of presentation for UiPath. I teach UiPath within my COE. I run COEs and I set COEs up, and I teach UiPath to high schoolers. And I also mentor different organizations, not on a volunteer basis. I have 3 high school UI arts this year that are actually doing an internship at UiPath. And I have 5 that are in training this summer and into next year. And that's a newer program that we started with the UiPath CEO. One of the things I've learned, or I've experienced as I've been mentoring organizations, helping other organizations set up COEs, acting as a sounding board, an informal consultant, a member of a cohort, whatever you might want to call it. People come to me and they have asked me, okay, so how'd you start? You went to the academy, you learned UiPath, you learned how to do things. So, and then you were put in the role, and where do you begin? So that's kind of what I want to give a foundation of. I talked to Diana about this months ago. We started planning this. I told her this is what I want to do. I want to kind of give more of a basic, okay, what the heck do I do now that I know how to do this skill? I'll be leading sessions 1 and 2 on this. Let me change my slide because I kind of talk a lot, so you have to forgive me. I'll be doing sessions 1 and 2. We have Mason, another MVP is going to jump in and do session 3. And then session 4, he and I may tag team on that. And on session 4 will be the last one. So today we're just going to talk about what does the environment that you find yourself within. So typically we find a UiPath developer as part of a COE, Center of Excellence. It could be a lone person sitting in an organization that has everything thrown on their desk. It could be a person that's working for a consulting firm that's building for clients. It could be a person that's working for a very large organization that never meets the clients they're building for. I've witnessed, and I've worked with people in all of those different roles, and all of them have different dynamics that are dictate a whole different approach to how it is to be a developer. So let's first start by talking about some of the environments you might find yourself in. This presentation today doesn't include a lot of demos. It doesn't include any demos actually. And session 2 doesn't include demos. I know on session 3, Mason plans on doing some demos, and you'll get some demos on session 4. We're not here to teach you how to code. If at the end you have a coding question and you want to take it offline, I can share my email with you and do coding questions or mentoring for you offline. But let's talk about your UiPath practice, wherever you sit and find yourself. Typically in a UiPath practice, your organization is going to define some sort of operating model. what do we want UiPath? What do we want RPA to do for our organization? What are our strategies and goals with RPA? Are we going to be replacing people? Are we going to be replacing systems? Are we going to be replacing consultants? Are we going to roll off consultants? Are we going to be replacing contractors? Or are we just here to redistribute non-RPA work and bring more value to our organization and have our people do more value-added tasks? Are we trying to save SG&A? Are we just trying to get soft savings? Just how many hours can you free this person up from doing this job so they don't work on weekends and holidays? So you want to, as a UiPath developer, you want to understand what the operating model is for your practice. Now, you may go into an organization, you may be then brought into that organization. There are many organizations hiring right now for people to come in and set up a COE, to set up an RPA practice. This is all I've set up 2 RPA practices, and I probably have consulted with people or helped other organizations set up about 3 or 4 more as a sounding board. But officially, I've set up 2 COEs, 2 global COEs, and I'm on my 2nd right now. You want to know within your organization, if you're not typically if you're sitting in a COE and you're not in a consulting firm, and you may be in a COE within a consulting firm, who's your corporate champion? Who's the person that is going to bat for you behind the scenes? Who is the person that brought RPA into the organization? Who is the person that's advocating for RPA? Who's the person that at the end of the year, when they're going through the budget and they're evaluating the impact of RPA, is the one that says, no, we can't cut that program? You want to know who that person is. You want to let that person know who you are. You want to let that person know your skills if they don't already know your skills, whether you're entry level, mid-level, or if you're advanced in your skills. You want to let that person be comfortable with what you can do. And you want to be comfortable with that person and what their role is and what their expectations of you are. Typically in most, and I don't know why this is, in most organizations I've been with or worked with, typically the CFO is the person that usually champions UiPath to be brought into an organization. And the goal of most CFOs is to say, we're going to bring this into the finance organization, and we're going to shorten our closed window, or we're going to do all of these different things. But you'll find pretty quickly, if you're in a COE, that you're drawn in many different directions. You want to know what the roles are within your COE, or even if you're in a consulting firm and you're building for other people. How many other developers are there? Who's in charge of maintaining automations? Who's in charge of testing automations? It may be you doing it all. It may be a different group doing the testing. It may be a different group doing the business analysis, the front end setup. How do you get your work? Who gives you your work? You want to understand the roles. You want to be able to work within those roles, and you want to be able to capitalize on everybody else's role. And I know a lot of COEs, and a big push right now, in not only in my COE here, but in other COEs, is a certified RPA business analyst. And I have brought one into my COE here within the last 2 weeks. So he's new. Because you'll find quickly as a developer that there's a lot of front-end work that needs to be done that you can't always be focused on, but you need to be involved in. So you want to understand those roles. You want to understand within the environment you're sitting in as a UiPath developer, what is the measure of your success? Is it the number of automations that you're building each month or each week or each year? Is it the total amount of soft saving hours? Are you given a total amount of SG&A savings that you need to tackle, as I've been given? Are you being given, you need a certain run rates, you need a certain number of transactions processed, backlog processed, you want to maintain this many projects that are work in progress compared to this many projects that are next to come up. you want to understand what your measures of success are. And you want to understand that within that RPA roadmap. When I'm going to say for most organizations, probably not for all organizations, but for most, when a project or a program like RPA is brought into an organization, it has to fit within the corporate roadmap. What's the roadmap for your RPA practice? How does that fit into the corporate roadmap? Every organization has a strategy, a short-term strategy, a long-term strategy. How does RPA fit within that strategy? Where's your practice in the roadmap? Are you at the slam at the beginning of the roadmap and nothing's been done? You just bought the licenses and you just set up studio, or are you in the mid, or are you in an advanced roadmap where everybody's happy-go-lucky and you have a lot of advanced developers that you can use as sounding boards and mentors? So you want to understand your roadmap. Do you work in your organization with project managers and, like I said, business analysts? Now, I'm going to give my personal opinion in this presentation. Some of what I say is my personal opinion. Some of it is what I've experienced. And some of it is mistakes people have encountered that they've had to go back quickly when they've envisioned an RPA practice. Business analysts in the early days of RPA were not numerous. It was usually given to the developer through the whole the software development lifecycle. Business analysts have, and Diana, correct me if I'm wrong, I know UiPath has just within the last couple of years really focused on business analysts, and COEs are starting to see more business analysts as well.
Yeah, they have a new certification out for business analysts now too.
Yes. Business analysts are going to, you'll find a business analyst to be very vital on, not necessarily always on what we call low-hanging fruit, the really quickies that you can knock out while you're waiting for all your other lab partners to finish their portion of the lab so you can turn it in your science class. The business analysts are going to be the ones that are going to work on those big cross-functional automations that are going to go throughout the whole organization, have a really deep impact. And so business analysts are key. Now, when it comes to project managers, now, again, this is my opinion, and if you all are project manager, please forgive me. I don't have anything against you personally, but project managers, I find, don't add as much value, I won't say a lot, as much value to an RPA practice as does a business analyst. A project manager can sometimes, because of the way a project manager thinks, they can get, I guess, too far out of the weeds. And if you've developed anything already, you know that as a developer, you have to be in the weeds a lot. Now, I have had very large automations in my career. And I've built, I guess I'm on almost my 415th automation now. I've built some very large projects. I mean, very large projects where we did bring in a project manager, not to coordinate the build necessarily, but to coordinate the people involved in the project and the front end work that needed to be done before I could actually get in, or it was actually me and another developer, before we could actually get in there and start building code. And in those kind of instances, you're going to build those in agile sprints, but you still need a project manager then to coordinate all those people, because you can't necessarily do that yourself. And in those kind of very large projects, you'll also typically find you'll have multiple business analysts, and you'll need a project manager to coordinate that. Typically, that's the only time I really bring in a project manager into an automation project. Otherwise, I'll just rely on business analysts. All right, so we talked a little bit about a COE. Center of Excellence. Is your COE, if you are in a COE, is it centralized or is it siloed? Centralized would mean that your COE is kind of like a hub and spoke, right? Silo is kind of like you have 15 different departments in your organization, and each department has 1 or 2 developers. very little communication between each other, very little collaboration because you really don't cross, you don't have a kind of a horizontal into that silo. So are you centralized or in silo? Because it's going to change how you do your automations. It's going to change how you approach your automations, especially if you get into a cross-functional automation where you have to work with different silos. Is your RPA practice guided by a steering committee? Almost all, well, all of the COEs that I've helped establish are governed by a steering committee. And why do we do a steering committee? And I know someone's going to ask this question, so I'm going to answer it before someone asks it. In an organization, because of what RPA does, it replaces tasks. It takes tasks away from people, whether you want to call them redundant, whether, like I said, you're rolling off of a consulting contract or you're replacing a system. I know RPA is being used a lot right now, in my experience recently, especially to replace Alteryx because it's cheaper. When you're replacing a system, when you're replacing whatever you might be doing, you have people that are going to be impacted. And so typically a steering committee is going to be your corporate champion and any other C-suite people that need to be involved. Maybe your COO, your obvious, of course, your CTO, your chief technology officer. And then your executives, who's over your tax department, if you're coding or if you're going to be building for someone in finance, who's over your accounting department, who are your executives, your vice presidents. You always want those people involved because you'll find that the ideas, once those people are involved in the steering committee and they see what RPA is doing for the organization, you're going to find that you'll get a lot more top-down automation coming into your backlog instead of individual in. And I'll tell you about that on the next slide, how that's going to differ and be more important to you. So you want to know who is on your steering committee. Introduce yourself to the steering committee. Be familiar with what groups, what organizations they work within that organization, departments, divisions, whatever it might be. And what are the priorities of that steering committee? Are there priorities shared? I mean, you're going to have conflicting, and you're going to run into conflicting priorities in your steering committee. You're going to be asked to pivot quickly, and someone's going to say something's going to be a priority when someone else says something else is a priority. And that's when you want to be governed and make sure your steering committee is being governed by that roadmap, that corporate strategy, and how that RPA roadmap fits within that. So you can avoid that constant pivoting, so you don't walk around wearing a neck brace from whiplash. And then last but not least on this slide, you definitely want to know whether you're in a consulting firm and you're building for a client or you're sitting within the client. If you're sitting on the business side, if you're sitting on the IT side, regardless of what you do with automation, because of the nature of automation and RPA, you want to know about your IT department. Okay, you want to know about your security. Who's in charge of giving you security to systems? Who's in charge of, if you need to spin up servers? Some organizations are going to be using the UiPath cloud bots, and they'll have servers spun up based on their automation needs and robot units. Some may have virtual machines spun up by UiPath in the cloud that they're paying robot units for every month. Some of you may have an on-prem UiPath instance, which is getting rarer and rarer, or is that more rare, should I say? And some of you may be in cloud UiPath. In all instances, you're more than likely working with virtual servers, which your bots sit within, or a virtual machine. So who's going to do that? And you want to know kind of ballpark what the cost of that is, because that's going to come into your metrics. And how are those servers set up? How are the systems? Do you have, if you have an ERP system, you're going to be coding within either for yourself or a client. Is that going to be going through a UI, or is it going to be going through a client sitting on a machine in that server somewhere? So you want to be fully aware, even if you're building for a client, what their servers, how they're going to deploy this, how it's being run within that organization or within your organization. Who's maintaining that server? Who's updating Microsoft in that server? Who's doing server maintenance on the cache? Who's going to be in charge if that server goes down? Who do you reach out to? You want to be aware of that. Firewalls, the same thing. Especially if you're going into SaaS solutions or third-party solutions that your organizations may contract with, whether you're building for a client or you're building for yourself. You may have SaaS solutions that you're contracting with that you don't own, that your data just sits within, that you didn't buy, you're just renting, so to speak. You want to know how make sure those firewalls are opened up for all your bots. And what are the limitations of those firewalls? Are you using an FTP interface, whatever it might be? Access kind of goes with your security. What do you need for access? Okay, let's say you're sitting in a consulting firm and you're building for a client. Is the client set up in their access? Are they set up with service accounts? Are those service accounts Active Directory accounts? Do those service accounts have Active Directory credentials? Do those Active Directory credentials have individual email addresses within those servers? If you're sitting within your COE, how many different service accounts do you have? Do you have to worry about segregation of duties? If you're working in finance, do you have to have different bots doing different things because of segregation of duties? One bot's uploading or preparing a journal entry, another bot's evaluating that journal entry against data and submitting it into your ERP. Both bots can't do the same thing because of segregation of duties. So you want to make sure that you're following that access, and within that, those audit trails, audit logs, what you need to show for audit. If you're governed by Sarbanes-Oxley, or your client is, or your organization is, what you need to show for audit for SOX artifacts for when those SOX audits come out. Now, I will tell you that the big four audit firms, just as an offhand tangent conversation, the big four audit firms do use UiPath RPA. Some use Automation Anywhere, but they all use some form of RPA. So they know what RPA is, and they know what they need, and they're going to be very, very, I should say, sure that your RPA segregation of duties and how you manage your RPA, and you do your log files, and you do your artifacts for audit and your archiving. They're going to make sure that you're doing that within the bounds of SOX. Any questions? I know Diana said that wait till the end or put it in the chat, but I'm a very informal guy and she knows that. So any questions before I go on to the next slide? Anybody? Or do I hear crickets? Good, I hear crickets. That means I'm doing a good job. I'm answering the questions before they're asked, or you all are all asleep, so that's good with me. All right, let's talk about the focus of your COE or your RPA practice, or what you're supposed to be doing. 3 different types of ways you're going to get automation ideas. And if your COE is new, and I've done 2 new COEs and I've jumped into one of them. Current COE I'm sitting in, we built it from, me and the voices in my head, built it from the ground up. Started with nothing, and we now have a global COE. So there's a whole part of RPA that involves evangelism. And what is RPA? What can it do? What can it do for me? What can it not do for me? What's the impact of RPA on my job? Am I going to lose my job? Are you trying to replace me? Do I need to find another job? Do I need to start saving 3 months of salary so when I get laid off, I'm not going to be destitute and lose my home? These are all things that run through people's heads. Because if you think about what people do at work, they come into their job and they do, especially during close, they come in and they run a series of reports in some system. They take those reports and they consolidate that data, for example, then they add and subtract and they analyze and they map it to other data, and they put it in some sort of format, and it's uploaded into a system, or it's evaluated by somebody for accuracy, and then it's put into your ERP system. That's what they do every day. On the days they're not doing that necessarily, they may do something else that's very manual. They may have to look through an Excel spreadsheet and compare it to the last month's Excel spreadsheet and see if there's anything that's changed. And these people that are doing this may have been with the organization that you're automating for, whether it's yours or a client, for many, many years. And this is what they've done for many, many years. It may not be what they were hired to do. They were probably hired based on their skill set or their education or their background to do something totally different for the company. But when they got into the company, this is what they were doing, and this is what their job has become. And because that's what they do and that's what they identify with, they don't necessarily know. And we'll talk a little bit more about personalities and people and how they would relate to RPA on the next session. But just to touch on it really briefly here, they don't necessarily know anything else that they should be doing because that's what their job is. And that's what they think their job role is supposed to be. And in times like recently, especially with inflation, you will find very quickly that these are also the people that are first to be laid off, whether they've been with the organization for 20 years or whether they've been with the organization for 2 or 3. So just to give you that background, there has never been an instance in my experience working with myself, with other teams, with other organizations, with other people that are my cohort. I have a cohort that we meet every Friday, and we just informally, we talk about challenges we have with our automations that we're building now for our organizations or our clients, different ideas on how to tackle those challenges. And I've been part of this cohort, just an informal group of friends of mine now for about 3 or 4 years. And you'll quickly find that we've all met this challenge of resistance from people. And it's something that in some organizations, you're going to be very popular because of your job. In some organizations, the first time someone gets laid off because their job was automated, you're going to be the unpopular one. No one's going to want to talk to you. So your job as an RPA developer within working within automations in your organization or for your client is to be the most popular guy you can be. That means you need to know everybody's name. You need to understand what they do. You need to say, okay, you know how to do this. I just knew that I was just talking to James the other day, and he's over in accounting. I know he's looking for somebody. And if we take this away from you, maybe you can go work for James. You have to be that person. And unfortunately, being an RPA developer is just not about sitting at your desk and playing on Studio every day and putting something into UAT, fixing anything that's wrong in UAT and pushing it to production. And then if something changes, you come back and maintain it. And I know that there's always this type of, I don't want to call it a misnomer, but this myth, I should say, that coders and IT people are more loners and they're more individual collaborative contributors. They don't work in teams. They work better. They feel like they work better if they're sitting in their cubicle. No one's bothering them. They just do their work. And as a UiPath developer in an organization where you're taking over tasks from people, you have to be a people person. You have to be that person that talks to people in the elevator and walks down to their cube and you have to let people know who you are and that you're not some evil demon coming in and starting to automate their job work. All right. Different ways to get your work is individual. There's a risk with individuals. It's a good starting point, especially if your COE is new, your RPA practice is new. It's a good starting point. These individual automations, things that people bring to you saying, hey, I do this, are typically going to be what we call low-hanging fruit. They're not going to be really complex. They may have some complexities, but they're easy to overcome. And that word of mouth is going to is going to help progress RPA because people talk. And people talk that office grapevine's more impacting in an organization than an email from the CEO. So if you're doing something, if you're getting some individual work and someone starts you and says, okay, Beth over here needs you to do these things, or we're losing this person and we're going to give this to this person, but we want you to do this to help this person type of deal. You want to make sure you treat it as if it's a cross-functional big thing. It may be minuscule to you. It may be a quick 2-hour build, 3-hour build. You may think it's a waste of your time, but it's never a waste of your time because you're helping somebody to accept RPA. You're building word of mouth and you're building a good reputation for it. You're helping overcome resistance that may come down the line, especially if Beth talks to James and James talks to David. You're building that network and people then know who you are. They say, oh, can you do this for me? But the risk you have there is individuals leave organizations, whether voluntarily, involuntary. Beth may say, okay, I have a better job offer down the street at $10 more an hour. I'm going to go down the street and work there. So in that instance, who's taking over what you did for Beth? Was that indeed a waste of your time because Beth is no longer here? So who's going to take that over? And that happens quite often when you work with individuals and you're doing individual automations that have not a lot of bearing on a department, but they have a bearing on that individual. So in that, when you're working, whenever you're working with an individual and you're doing an individual automation for that person, you want to make sure that you involve that person's manager in that, what you're doing for them, so that your manager knows these things that this person did now are automated. Who's going to take over those tasks and those automations? Because I'm going to tell you flat out, automations break, automations stop, systems go down, third-party systems change their UIs and the selectors don't work anymore, no matter how robust you made them. You may have a third-party system that's coming up with their conference and they're advertising their conference on the home screen and your bot has never seen this advertisement before, and it stops and you programmed it if it can't get into the system to stop the automation and send you a log message or fail something or something along that line. You need to have that manager involved in your automations that you then know who to go to, who's going to be in charge. If that automation stops, who's going to take over that manual piece? Okay. Now, especially in a situation where, is everybody still awake? Hopefully, sorry. In a situation where, for example, there was no documentation when you started on the manual piece, you automated something and you built some documentation. You want to make sure that your documentation you do even for an individual is as detailed as it would be for a department or a cross-functional automation. That documentation needs to be that detailed so that someone can jump into that documentation that you're building, whether it be a process design document or a technical design document. And I hope that everybody that is building on this call is documenting their automations in detail. If you're not, you need to know more about doing that. Reach out to me and I can work with you and teach you how to do that. So, individual, good starting point. Good way to get the rapport going, good way to get your practice going. Kind of like if you're a brand new dentist, you're saying, okay, taking new patients. That's what individual is. Department silo is typically not going to be individual driven. If Beth comes to you and says, hey, can you do this for our department? And Beth is not a manager of that department. You want to say, yes, let's get with your manager and let's talk about this. Departments, or what I call silo automations, are manager down, driven down automations. They impact the entire department, not just an individual within that department. You may be rolling off a consulting contract. You may be rolling off some contractors. Their contract may be coming up and you don't want to bring them on because contractors are more expensive than employees. You may be doing something, or you may be rolling off a system that department uses, you may be replacing that with RPA. Those need to be manager driven down. And that manager needs to be involved in every facet of what you're doing in that automation. That manager needs to be on every line of communication with that automation. And you may think that a manager already gets too many emails. He doesn't want more emails. But you will find if you don't even start emailing that manager is going to come to you and say, why aren't you telling me what's going on? All right. So you want to make sure that you're communicating with that manager. Now, the manager does not have to be your subject matter expert. Your subject matter expert's going to be the subject matter expert of what you're automating for. And that would be your one. You want to make sure that all of your communication goes through that one, what we call a SME, subject matter expert. And that would be who you're working with. If the scope changes, you want to make sure that subject matter expert gets with the manager, and you and the manager, the SME, are all on the same page. So again, department silo, you're starting to get bigger in your practice. Your people, the manager is going to help you overcome people's fear of losing their jobs or losing their loss of functionality within the organization, losing their relevance, losing their importance. What am I going to do if you take this away from me? And that's going to be something that you, on these department ones, you have to rely on the manager to do. You're not answering those questions for that person anymore. It's not your job to answer that question. That's the manager's job. So you want to make sure that manager's involved. So you never do something for a department without that manager being involved for that department. And when you're in a department silo, you want to make sure when you're taking the automation from that department, and you'll find really quickly that once your individuals start talking to your managers, it's kind of like a snowball or a ball rolling down the hill. Your manager is going to start saying, okay, let's do this, this, and this. And you may find in talking with that manager that the return on investment of you building that is really not doing much for the department. So you want to make sure that that is actually going to be a pertinent automation for that department, and that manager understands that if it's not something pertinent or something that really has an impact on the department, you put that in your backlog. You may get to that later. But you want to make sure that your manager is focused on, with our automation, your manager is focused on a bigger picture than just individual small pieces. You want those individual small pieces to be part of a bigger picture. And then you want to build with that manager on those department automations. You want to build some sort of metrics, some sort of KPIs that you can measure that automation success and performance. Finally, is cross-functional. These are big ones. And these are the fun ones. I love cross-functional. In fact, you'll find many organizations now that are not just starting out with their RPA practice. Many organizations now are taking their RPA, the developer-driven RPA, because UiPath offers something called Citizen Developer Studio X. And when you're in a mature RPA practice, you're going to find that most of these small individual ones that we talked about, organizations are starting to cater to those with Citizen Developers or Studio X, which is much less developer intuitive. You don't need to do so much coding, you just drop and drag type of deal. Cross-functional ones are the big ones. The big ones, and we call them cross-functional because they cross functional boundaries. They cross different departments. They may go from, I have one in this organization now that's going from IT through every system this organization has, regardless of what touches, whether it be finance, whether it be inventory, whether it be store facing, whether it be store support, whether it be warehouse, our WMS system. It touches every single department. And we've been working on this one. This will be our 6th month. It'll be a year-long project for us here. But the benefits of that are millions of dollars in savings. So in a large cross-functional automation, you want to understand who are the players. If we're doing this for 4 departments, what other departments are going to be impacted by what we're doing for these 4 or 5 departments? What other departments are we relying on information for to come into our uplines and downlines? All of those people have to be involved in your project team. And on a cross-functional automation, you need to have a project team. You need to have an individual from everybody all your stakeholders that would be impacted by that automation on that team. You may think to yourself, that's a lot of people. This is where your project manager comes in, or your business analysts come in to manage all those. But you need all of that input to make sure that your automation is robust enough to be forward-looking, to make sure that your automation will be flexible and scalable for when one of those systems changes or something in that department, when those uplines or downlines change, you want to make sure your automation is responsive. So you want to have all those people on your project team. I know that's a lot of voices, but that's where your project manager comes in, your business analyst. And you may have one business analyst. I've been on cross-functional projects where I've had one business analyst on this cross-functional projects right now. I just told you about, I have 3. So, and one of them's mine and 2 of them are not. So you want to have the business analyst will be determined by that project team and the inputs for that cross-functional automation. What do we need the different business analysts to do? Because certain business analysts are going to be more attuned and expert in certain areas than in others. Excuse me, and source of information. We already discussed a little bit about that. What are your inputs? How often do your inputs change? What guidelines are you operating under? What requirements are you operating under? Your single flow of communication source in a big cross-functional automation, that would be your business analyst or your project manager. In smaller cross-functional automations, I typically make my business analyst my single flow of communication source, and that allow that business analyst then to be that person that everybody else goes to, because that helps avoid scope creep. When you get into these large cross-functional automations, you're going to get scope creep. You're going to have different people say, oh yeah, if we're doing this, can we also do this? Because this will be impacted by this. And you want those BAs, business analysts, and those project managers to really evaluate scope creep. Because if you get too much scope creep, you will never finish your automation. And you will never allow the organization to realize the benefits of what you've been working on. And finally, in these large cross-functional organizations, you want to be able to break the process into sub-process. So for example, the one that I'm working on now, that covers so many departments, has 9 different automations within this one task. And each of those automations has a different function, a different upline, a different input, and perhaps even a different output, and runs at a different time. And so we build these in what we call agile sprints. So we'll build the one and release it and start working with the other ones based on the release of the one. So you have, on this one, we have 9. I'm sorry, that's wrong. I'm looking at my whiteboard now. I have 10. I apologize. I have 10. 10 different automations within this one large project. And again, these are the fun ones, guys. These are the fun ones to work on, because you're really solving some really complex issues and some really complex problems, especially when you're working with different systems that are dynamically doing different things for the organization. All have different interfaces, or different APIs, different needs. Maybe you're going into a database. These are the fun ones. These are the ones that keep you awake at night thinking about how you can do this, and flow charting at 3 in the morning on your Microsoft Surface from experience. All right. Talked for 46 minutes. Any questions for me? Thoughts? Hated it, loved it. Hated me, loved me. Hate Diane, love Diane.
Yeah, and feel free to take yourself off mute. The whole point of these topics are for people to, talk out loud or bring up some issues they might have in their organizations, or try to get some directions on things that they're facing.
Yeah, and like I said, guys, this subject matter one. Most of these types of sessions I've been to have been about, okay, how do I automate this? And I've held them, and Dinah's posted some for me on the RE framework and things like that, where we get into the guts of actually automating and answering questions and doing APIs. But this one's more about, okay, where am I? What the heck am I doing? Should I really have gotten into knowing this UiPath stuff?
This is Brian Lamb. I've been enjoying the presentation. Thank you for that. It is the middle of my workday, so I had to multitask a little bit. So forgive me if I missed this, but do you have any insight or thoughts about like the composition of teams, for example, within COEs? Do you how many RPA developers versus analysts versus testers do you find? And do you generally break them up into lots of smaller teams, big teams? Any thoughts on that?
Sure, I'll tell you how I've done it. I'll use the COE that I built here, which as an example. The COE started here with me, okay? And I had set up the orchestrator, I set up the bots, I negotiated licensing based upon what the organization that I'm with, what their vision was, what capacity do we need, how soon did they want to get to a certain capacity. Then I meet with my champion, the C-suite, the steering committee, once a month, and I say, okay, here's where we're at in our roadmap. And every month we present we present what we call the status of the RPA roadmap. And so we had an RPA roadmap, and then I tell them where we are in the roadmap, and based on the amount of work and the type of work I have, and the number of cross-functional compared to departmental, compared to individual I have. So as that backlog and that work in progress started to grow and it started to vary into much larger automations, then I said, okay, I need a BA now, or I need 2 BAs, or I need something like that. So to answer your question, Brian, it really depends on where you're at. How much work do you have? In my experience, I've seen departments that had or RPA developer pools that had 6 or 7 automation developers that had 2 or 3 supervisors over those developers that also developed, and they had a separate team that did testing, and then they had in some of those instances they just got work in a form of a kind of like an abstract. They didn't get a PDD. They didn't get any details. They weren't involved in the brainstorming. They just got kind of like a package that you get in high school and said, work through it. So ideally, in my opinion, Brian, to answer your question, if I have, like I have now, I have about 120 in my backlog. I have 23 that are in progress. I have 2 large cross-functionals, and I have 3 that are next to come up in the next week. I have 3 developers underneath me that handle that. And I have 1 BA that we just brought on. And that's really good for where I'm at now. As we start to grow, because right now we haven't even touched here, customer facing inventory, warehouse or things like that in great depth, or payroll or HR. As that starts to grow, then I'll start bringing more people on. But you want to make sure that you're not unnecessarily spending the company's money when there's not enough work to support that. I hope that answered your question.
Yep, thanks. Looks like Jane has a question in the chat there.
Hi, I'm Jane Walker, and
Okay.
so Chris, nice to meet you and appreciate this this presentation. I'm an engineering manager at Dick's Sporting Goods, overseeing a team of 3 RPA developers and 2 contractors, and
Okay.
we have, I guess I should say, 3 of those RPA. 1 is more like a business analyst, and we've still growing our team. But my question is around standards, and where I'm seeing an issue, or I should say where I'd like clarification on, is we have about 30 bots running in production. And right now there's an email when there's a problem. It could be a business exception or it could be a system exception. And in both cases, it's an email. So then it comes in and the person who wrote the bot starts an email trail. And before you know it, 30 emails later, you have this big long trail. And so I'm wondering, what is your approach for bot alerts, whether it's
So-
system or business?
So you have 30 automations or 30 different bots?
30 different bots that are running on a schedule.
So you have 30 bots. How many automations does each of the bot run?
So this is where my ignorance will come in. So I could just say they're bots, but they run a number, when you say automations, like a number of steps. So like say,
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, so, okay. No, it's fine. I thought at a large retailer like Dick's, I thought when you said 30 bots, in RPA, a bot is kind of like what runs the automation. So we put an automation into production in that, and then we turn that on to a bots, and the automation may have steps in it that sends the email, right? So in your case, here's how I handle exceptions. I just call them business rule exceptions or system exceptions. In depending on the system that I'm going into, I may turn off system exceptions completely. So if I'm going into a third-party system with one of my automations, and that system does not perform or react the way that it originally does or typically does, and my automation is having difficulty running it, I'm going to have my bot stop and send the developer that built it, just like you, an email. That developer's job that is, and in that process, Jane, the bot's going to take a picture of what it sees by taking a screenshot, right? So the developer should be able to see what the bot sees, right? At that point, it's that developer's job. That developer built the automation. It's that developer's job to then maintain and find out how to fix that automation. And it may not be something the developer can do. It may be something that IT has to handle or that third-party system has to handle. But that email stops there. Bot doesn't escalate or do any other email strings with that. Does that help answer? But that's
and maybe
what
it's the way ours are built. So for every process that's run every day, an email will be sent out. And maybe the email is saying, hey, I processed X number of records today.
And that's good practice.
Yeah.
That's best practice. To have your automation, best practice is to have all your automations in an RE framework, whether it's in the linear RE framework or regular RE framework. There's two types. Best practice is to have the bot, when it receives a task or starts a task, to send an email to that stakeholder saying, I've started your task. And when the bot finishes that task, it's best practice to have that bot send an email saying, we finished your task. That's good. So if you're doing that, that's best practice. For exceptions, the emails need to go through to whoever built it. Now, if that person leaves, we typically will put the developer that built it into the code pointing at a credential in the orchestrator. So if Jane Walker built that automation, then that credential within the automation is going to point to your name and as the person who built it, that's who's going to get the email. We call it developer email in my world. And we put that into a credential asset, and that automation then references that credential asset, and that email goes to the developer. There's also the ability in Orchestrator to have alerts sent to you by email. And if you want to avoid, let's say, for example, somehow your bot got it into an infinite loop, or it's not processing, or it's been pending forever and it's just not starting. There is the ability in Orchestrator, if you want, we can take it offline and I can demonstrate that to you, to have Orchestrator notify you through alerts or even an email that says, you have this problem here and you need to fix this problem. And you can do that as well. You can also in Orchestrator plan for your automation that if it hasn't finished running by a certain time, and let's say you have an automation that runs in 10 minutes, and it's been 30 minutes and it's still running, well, then there's something wrong with your automation. You can program that in Orchestrator to actually turn that automation and stop that automation. Does that help?
It does. I just feel like from my standpoint, and I'm not as close to it, I feel like I'm in email overload. So I'm seeing all of these emails and not like, I guess offhand, my overall question for you is, do you have a set of standards for when you first write a button, how these, what type of emails are sent out into
Yes,
who,
we-
and that it's very clear on
Right.
where
we
it
do it.
came from and who it's for?
And I can kind of remove I call them we call them global development standards.
Okay,
And it covers everything from how you code, where you put screenshots in, how you do your exception planning. If you use how you use nested ifs, when you use nested ifs. It covers how you name your automations, how you annotate, how you label your automations. It covers all of this, how you set up your configuration files. And all of our developers have to follow those same development standards, because then when we do code reviews, if they don't follow the standards, they have to fix them to follow the standards. And I'll
Okay.
doctor ours up for you a little bit.
that'd
And
be great.
if somehow you could send me your email, or Diana, if you communicate with,
I'll put it
Diana,
right in here. So it's
Um,
very,
I'll doctor them up to take any proprietary
great, Jane.
information out. And I'll send those to you, and that maybe help you a little bit on how to start developing your own development standards.
because we have started some, but because of it's not my expertise, is I'm looking to other sources to say who's have a mature process in following it. Because at this point, for our 3 different people that are developing, you can almost tell who wrote what. So that means we're not following a standard. And
Correct.
so it's nice to see, well, it'd be nice to see, well, what are those?
Yeah, and I'd be more than happy to hold some informal sessions with your team to help them kind of bring
Great.
in and understand how that works.
Okay. I would really appreciate it. Thank you.
Nope, I've done it before, not a problem.
Yeah, and Chris, I just sent you an email, and Jane, I copied you.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. All right, we've got about 1 minute towards time. Anybody else have any questions? All right, next week, I think we've moved the times to earlier in the day. to
We
make it
did.
a little more convenient for everybody, so you're not sitting there trying to eat your macaroni and cheese and talk to me. Next week, we're gonna talk a little bit more about personalities and people. And then Mason's gonna come in on the following week and do some more kind of demos and things. And then we'll end up with how to manage your work. And that's probably one of the most challenging things any of you all have probably experienced. All right, I appreciate the time, guys. Look forward to seeing you all next time.
Thank you, Chris, for speaking today. This was really good. And thank you all for joining. We hope to see you at next week's session. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Uh-huh.